Hi. Okay, so yeah, as was said, I'm going to be talking about biometric surveillance networks. A lot of this has to do with, as a journalist, a lot of stuff that I've followed in the area of biometric privacy and surveillance in the course of covering a lot of stuff for various outlets that I write for. So this is going to be kind of like a way to condense and sort of like hopefully demystify a lot of the sort of various stories that are out there about biometrics and how they're being collected, who they're being shared with, and at the end I'm going to mention a couple of ways that we might be able to sort of like adapt to the way that biometrics have sort of changed the environment that we're in. So just really briefly, I'm a journalist and researcher. I focus mostly on privacy surveillance. And here are some of the places I've written for. My PGP fingerprint, in case you want to discuss crimes. And yeah, so I guess these are sort of three kind of core ideas that I guess like statements that have like informed my thinking about this talk and the stuff that I'm gonna talk about today, about how we sort of understand what a surveillance network is and how it exists. And so the first thing is that understanding surveillance systems as a form of geography. So sort of like in the way that we kind of have this idea, we've been sort of like realizing that the internet is just sort of like a layer of reality that now sort of like exists on top of physical reality. Surveillance networks, as we experience them, are sort of just like another layer on top of the information networks that we sort of like already know of. Secondly, that now that these information networks have become ubiquitous and are, basically like permeate everything, every time that a surveillance system or network or something like this is established, it's a kind of environmental change. So we experience these things more as changes in our environment than changes in technology, because the technology to most people is completely invisible. And so I've been sort of like it's been more useful to me to like envision these things I'm going to talk about as environmental changes that are taking place instead of technological changes. And then finally, by mapping and sort of understanding the different sort of contours of these environmental changes, we can sort of figure out ways to possibly adapt to them. Human beings always, and all animals adapt to their environments, and so a lot of privacy and surveillance stuff has to do with like kind of being really scary, and what are we going to do about it, and like maybe we can use Tor and PGP and all this other stuff. But I think a more constructive way of approaching it, instead of just saying like what tool should I use or should I download Signal or whatever, is to like think about it in terms of like what these things are here. We need to find ways to change our behavior or our thinking in order to adapt to them. So I guess the one thing about when I use the term biometric surveillance or a map of biometric surveillance, I guess I'm not specifically going to be actually drawing a map on the screen right now. What I mean by a map is more like we're going to sort of try and deconstruct the various components of what of all these different biometric surveillance networks that currently exist, and try and sort of create a taxonomy so that we can identify the different parts and sort of understand how they function, and all this good stuff. So to that end, the actual content of like what a biometric surveillance network, like what kind of data is in it. So we're talking about a lot of things that you're probably already familiar with. Faces and fingerprints are probably the two categories that are the most familiar. Face recognition is like in the news constantly. I'm going to be talking about it quite a bit because it is, obviously a huge, probably I think the most significant change that's come about in this area. Then there's other stuff like retinas, irises, iris scanning, DNA, which is now being collected at pretty alarming ways. Voice prints, so the thing that you're constructing every time you tell Alexa to turn your smart light bulbs on and off, and all that stuff. Oops. Good call. Thanks. And then kinetic fingerprints is sort of a term that I've read that a number of researchers have used to describe the sort of the way your body moves forms a sort of unique pattern, and you may have heard of like gait recognition, like surveillance cameras watch you walking, and by analyzing like the pattern of your walking and the way your body moves, they can sort of identify you by how your body moves. And then also tattoos, which is a very sort of, I feel, under-discussed biometric feature that's being collected right now, and we'll go into that as well. So here's a couple of notable biometric surveillance networks that exist right now, most of which are sort of like federal government controlled. The first one is the oldest one probably. It's called IAFIS, or the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System. It's been in use by the FBI for decades. It's basically what stores all these fingerprints. Fingerprints were the first sort of like, I guess, notable biometric feature to be collected en masse by government agencies, and they're still today. And IAFIS is basically just the huge sort of centralized database that gets fed in from local and state law enforcement agencies and to the FBI, and in both directions, vice versa. So, and then the second one is something you might have heard of recently in relation to talk about facial recognition, it's called NGI, or Next Generation Identification and Interstate Photo System, also controlled by the FBI. There's a lot of face recognition photos in this database. There was actually a really major report that came out a couple of weeks ago about the FBI and state and local law enforcement agencies and their collection of face recognition photos, which I'm going to go into. And then it turns out that also, as we found out relatively recently, there is another system within the FBI that is devoted to facial recognition, which is called FACE, Facial Analysis Comparison and Evaluation Service. And what that basically is a way of the FBI sort of being able to track and match different faces across different geographic locations or periods of time. And then the next one is called OBIM, which is the Office of Biometric Identity Management, which is controlled by the Customs and Border Patrol, Department of Homeland Security. And basically what that is every time someone who's not a U.S. citizen comes into the U.S., this is the giant database that stores all of the biometric information that's taken mandatorily from anyone who's not a U.S. citizen who enters the U.S. In a lot of cases. I think there are waivers for some countries. And then finally, we have things like Google and Facebook, who are, I think maybe arguably the biggest collectors of biometric data of all, because we give them, photos which have biometric information, facial biometric information in them and whatnot, and we do it voluntarily, and they have, Facebook has like close to 2 billion users now or whatever. So what can you do with biometric data? This is probably like going to get into the actual way that these systems actually function. So the first and most obvious thing is identification. By linking a biometric feature to a persistent identity, being able to say that this fingerprint or face belongs to this person. Tracking, which is what I mentioned just a second ago, which is matching biometric features that have been observed across multiple different times and locations. So being able to, usually the way that this works is that it's not like an exact match. So a face recognition system, for example, will say, okay, you're searching for this face. I have a couple of matches, and here is the sort of percentage of certainty that that the system has that this is the same person or that this face is a match. So being able to say that this face was seen at a protest recently, and then 2 days later, a face with 96% certainty is the same face appeared leaving an AA meeting or whatever, what have you. And then the last category is authentication. So this is like what you're doing with your phone to get into your phone now. Like a lot of people are using fingerprint unlock because basically every phone now has a fingerprint unlock mechanism. And basically having access to fingerprint data, I'll go into this a bit later, but you might have seen that recently there have been some stories about how it's possible to print a working fingerprint that can unlock a phone without the person physically there, and then also the fact that you don't have any rights to deny. You can not give police, if you're arrested or something, you cannot give police a password. Like, you don't have to self-incriminate yourself under the Fifth Amendment, but your fingerprint or your face or whatever unlocks your phone is not information. It's part of your body, and so courts have ruled that if you're compelled by the police to unlock your phone or device using one of those features, you can't say no, because it's not information. It's just a part of your body. Okay, so these are sort of the three broad-ish categories that I've come up with for describing the actual sort of like components of a biometric surveillance network. So the first is what I call entry nodes. So if you're familiar with networking, or maybe if you've used Tor before, you know that like Tor is sort of an anonymity network where you enter into the network from a point, and then it goes through a hop, and then it goes through another hop, and then you end up on the end. So kind of the same concept. Entry nodes are essentially what are responsible for enrolling you in the system. These are things that basically like sometimes will assign an identity, sometimes won't assign an actual direct identity to, but nevertheless capture biometric features into the system in some sort of like registry. The second is processing, which is basically, these are the things that store all the data, that do all the complicated algorithmic, black magic that causes, you to be able to match faces across different geographic locations and times. And then making use of that is the third category, which are sensors, which are essentially like the nervous system. Like, these are the points where, the surveillance camera that you walk by, where your face gets captured, and then, oh, is this person's face match that's in a database? Oh, okay, that's the same person. And what that enables is real-time detection, massive scale tracking, and identification. And I'll go into a little bit about that later. So just first off, just to describe what enrollment is, the thing that you're already probably familiar with this process if you have a phone that has a fingerprint reader on it, because you've done this screen, which is where you sort of tap your finger a couple of times onto the phone to register your fingerprint in the phone. So the difference being that in this case, at least as far as we know, those fingerprints are they're not leaving the device. You're registering your fingerprint to your device and only to your device so that it can recognize you when you touch it again. So enrolling, registering and storing an individual's biometric features within a system, device, or database. Like I said, I think I mentioned just a second ago that it doesn't necessarily need to be linked to your name or a persistent identity of any kind. Enrollment is just sort of like a formalized process of, this is a mechanism that's meant for capturing your biometric data in like the most efficient way possible. So like a mugshot would be an example of an enrollment, because a mugshot is specifically designed to, like, it's not like you're passing by a camera. It's like, this is a process that's specifically meant to enroll you in the system. And then, like I said before, combined with sensors and processors, basically these sort of big data powerhouses, you get enrolled biometrics that can be compared with field-collected samples, like identification, or used to gain access, which is authentication. So just a couple of stats on enrollment. A lot of this is from this report that I have linked at the bottom, which I really encourage you to check out. It actually in the process of making this talk, this report came out, and it sort of demystifies and also adds a lot of interesting new information about what we suspected that we knew about the way that face recognition works in the United States. And again, also, I should probably note that a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is sort of US-centric, and that's just sort of for the sake of brevity and because of what I'm familiar with. But I encourage you to, if I'm missing out anything, to either tell me about it or go do research on your own about other countries and the way that their facial recognition and biometric surveillance networks work. So anyway, just these three really interesting stats that come from that report. Half of all Americans are now enrolled in a law enforcement face recognition database, 117 million people. So flip a coin. If it lands on heads, you're in a face recognition database. That's kind of insane. 1 out of every 4 state and local law enforcement agencies can now run face recognition searches. So they can compare their data to data in other systems or other databases that are run by other police agencies or federal law enforcement agencies. And this is probably the craziest thing, which we also had sort of suspected before, which is that 16 states currently allow driver's license and ID photos to be accessed by the FBI face recognition system. So just by virtue of having a driver's license or an ID, you're effectively in the FBI's face recognition database, because any search that they run on that database will also turn up data that's in the these DMV systems. So yeah, like I was just saying, DMVs are our first sort of like example of an entry node. So this is a map, again, from that same report, which you should check out. All of these states in dark blue are states where face recognition searches of driver's licenses and IDs are allowed. So, and then also mugshots. And then the rest of them, I think this is still not complete data, obviously, because a lot of these gray areas represent FOIA requests that are currently in progress, or they, different law enforcement agencies or state or local law enforcement agencies that haven't responded yet with some kind of clear answer as to whether or not they're doing this. And so the next category of entry node is probably the most common. It's, you've probably seen a couple of them walking down the street. There's thousands of them in New York City, cops. So a cop nowadays is not just sort of like a law enforcement officer in the way you normally think in the traditional sense. They're basically walking, talking biometric enrollment machines. A cop right now, so the most basic way that that's true is that, if you get arrested, if you're at a protest, whatever, if you get arrested, you're processed when you get into booking. You have your mugshot taken, you have fingerprints taken, you're in the system, you're enrolled, and unless you go through a complicated process to sort of expunge that record after your arrest, like if the charge gets dropped or expunged, there's no way you'll just always be in the system. So if you got arrested like a couple years ago and you like didn't do anything afterwards, there's a good chance that like that mugshot and those fingerprints are still in that system. So a couple of the more interesting and new ways that biometric data is taken by cops on the street is stuff like this. So there's an FBI pilot program, or quote unquote pilot program, because it's so large that it kind of seems really silly to call it a pilot program, but that's how they describe it, which has enrolled 434,000 arrestees' irises using these devices which scan irises. In early 2016, 189 iris scans were happening per day. And of course, all of this is subject to info sharing agreements with the Customs and Border Patrol, the Department of Defense, and a bunch of local law enforcement agencies. So they all, but once it's in this one of these databases, it's basically shared with all these other guys. And then this device is called the Stratus. It's by this company, Aoptics, and basically what it is it's a really fancy iPhone case. And it basically puts like a camera on your iPhone that's specifically designed for taking iris photos and enrolling them to the database like on the spot. So, and then there's sort of a bit more stuff with regard to cops approaching you on the street. This is actually a really disturbing trend, especially when you consider that most of the people who are subject to this kind of like on the street surveillance, like stop and frisk style surveillance, are communities of color and marginalized communities. And so this is actually something that ProPublica put out last month or 2 months ago, which showed that basically there's a couple of different states where cops are just going around stopping people and saying, hey, you should let me put a swab in your mouth and take your DNA sample. And a lot of people don't know that this is actually, like, they can't force you to do this. I should also mention, like, I'm not a lawyer. I probably should have put that in the the opening slide, but just to confirm, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice, but this is just to the best of my understanding. You do not have to comply with a cop who tells you that you need to take your DNA swab unless you're being arrested. Some of these, I think so Florida, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and North Carolina are the four states that are mentioned in this report that deal with cops sort of randomly approaching people on the street, and instead of stop and frisk, it becomes stop and spit, as they call it. because they take your DNA sample. And this machine on the left is made by GE. It's called DNA Scan, and it's basically a newer device which now enables DNA analysis to take place in under 2 hours. So you can not only be enrolled, but also have your DNA sort of like sequenced and analyzed within 2 hours time. And this thing is about the size of a microwave, so it can fit in just a small, like the nearest police station or whatever. And then, okay, so this is another thing that you might be familiar with, is that, basically, if you're not a U.S. citizen and you come to the U.S., you have to go through all these hoops and hoops and hurdles in order to get in, and that involves giving all 10 of your fingerprints and taking a photo, which gets enrolled, obviously, in the Office of Biometric Identity Management's photo recognition system, and that's pretty much stored forever. And it's any non-U.S. citizen that's visiting the U.S. between the ages of 14 and 79 has to do this on entry and exit, to my knowledge. And this is not sort of super surprising because a lot of other countries have similar systems to this. And then there's also other areas where apparently, I actually only became aware of this recently, but apparently when you come back into the U.S. as a U.S. citizen, there are a lot of airports now that make you take a sort of photo to present to the customs official, because normally, you come back into the U.S., if you're a U.S. citizen, you might be familiar with this, you come back into the U.S. and they ask you questions like, where were you, what were you doing there, blah, blah, blah. So as part of that process, I know in at least a couple of airports, and I haven't been able to get a good picture of the exact machine that I saw do this, but this seems to be a similar machine that basically what it does is the one that I saw was one that actually has like a hinge, and so it finds where your face is. It sort of just like moves down to look you directly in the face so that it can get a clear photo. Takes your photo, says 3, 2, 1 cheese. Takes your photo, then it prints up a thing. And the purpose of doing this is basically for ID confirmation. Like they're doing this to compare against the photo that's in your passport to make sure that you're not an imposter or something. And it's just kind of crazy because. Oops. It's just kind of crazy because, this is as a U.S. citizen, you have to do this now. So if you weren't in the face recognition database already, guess what? You are now. Okay. And then there's other ways to, submit biometric information to the U.S. government if you are really concerned about being inconvenienced at the airport. This is a service called Clear that basically gathers fingerprints and face recognition and photo and mugshot photos, essentially, that basically expedites your. It's kind of like if you're familiar with Global Entry or TSA PreCheck. Those are programs where basically you can pay a fee and do a background check, and then you get expedited screening, so you don't have to wait through the huge security line at the airport. So this is like a complement to that makes it even faster, supposedly. But the key difference is that it involves giving up your fingerprints and your photo and enrolling into a biometric network that's, in this case, owned by a private company in addition to being shared with U.S. law enforcement. And then there's really interesting stuff like, so tattoo recognition is actually a huge thing right now. So there's the EFF, which has done really great work on it, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, in case you're not familiar, has done really good work on this area. They've released a number of stories based on FOIA requests that they filed over the past month or so, which have basically found this program run by NIST, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, and the FBI, which basically went into a bunch of prisons and took photos of inmates' tattoos. Actually, I think it was both inmates and arrestees, and took photos of their tattoos and basically just gave it to a bunch of researchers and gave them this challenge. And so there's the first program was called TAT-C, which was for challenge. And then the program that's currently, that just started this summer is called TAT-E, which is for evaluation. And TAT-C, they basically just gave all of this tattoo data to a bunch of private research labs and said, hey, see what you can do with this. See if you can match people who have the same tattoo across different locations. And then the other sort of the reason why tattoos, I think, are a particularly sort of like nerve-wracking thing to collect in terms of biometric data is because tattoos aren't just like your face or your iris. They actually reveal things about your personality. They have, they're not just distinguishing marks. And they suggest association, religious affiliation, other things. And the crazy thing about this particular program is that the FBI and NIST basically said to these researchers, yeah, try and do this. Try and see if you can work out, like, who's in the same gang, who is in the same religion, or has the same beliefs or political ideologies, and, get back to us and let us know what you find. So that's this program. And then, of course, this is a very obvious sort of like, way to enter into any biometric system, which is to give it to Facebook or Google or whatever. Shout out to Fat, RIP, for this photo. Basically, Facebook actually has probably the biggest and most accurate face recognition system, more accurate than the FBI. I think most recently, at least according to their claims, they claimed about 97.5% accuracy, whereas the FBI's system claims about 85% accuracy. And it's actually funny because Google and Facebook and a bunch of other companies, including Snapchat, I think, are currently involved in an ongoing class action lawsuit because of a biometric privacy law in Illinois, which is one of only 2 biometric privacy laws that exists in the U.S., and it's the strongest among the 2, the other one being Texas. And basically, the law, the contents of the Illinois law basically forbids a company from collecting or using biometric data without explicit permission from the user. And so the concern here was that, if you're familiar with Facebook, if you use Facebook, you sometimes get what's called tag suggestions, where you see a face pop up and it says, do you know this person? Is this person, do we have it right? Like, is this the person that we think it is? And you can either say yes or no or ignore it, like you should, because you shouldn't be a narc. And so that's sort of the thing that triggered this Illinois privacy lawsuit, which is ongoing, and actually is kind of interesting because it might, it is actually Facebook and Google and these other Silicon Valley companies obviously were very upset about this, and they actually tried to get the venue of the court case moved to California, because technically, if under Facebook's terms of service agreement, all litigation that takes place against Facebook as a Facebook user needs to take place in California. And so that would have, initially, it was believed that, if that happened, that would sort of invalidate this whole case because, obviously the Illinois Biometric Privacy Act doesn't exist in California. But my understanding is that they did move the venue to California, but the Illinois privacy law is still in effect. So this is going to actually get hashed out, and we might actually wind up seeing a precedent emerge having to do with the corporate handling of biometric data as a result. So now we're going to go into the places that actually process all this information, that do all the data crunching, that run all the magic algorithms that compare people's faces and fingerprints and whatever. So this is a facility that I found a number of years ago, this is basically the facility for the FBI for all biometric and, in fact, all criminal information. All of what they consider electronic, criminal justice information is handled by this facility. It's the Criminal Justice Information Services is a division of the FBI that basically runs this place. It's in West Virginia, and it was completed in 1995. It's been around for a while, so it's because it's been collecting fingerprints and whatever, but now that all these other forms of biometric data are sort of getting out there, it's starting to focus heavily on these, on these new biometric, new kinds of biometric data. So this is actually what they call the Biometric Technology Center, which is part of that same facility, which just opened last year. And basically, their goal is to do research and development into finding new ways to exploit face recognition, iris, all these kinds of biometric data, and find new, build algorithms that will be able to better process this data. Fusion centers are something you're probably familiar with. You might have heard, after 9/11, basically, the government was like, we need more information sharing so that we can prevent terrorist attacks from happening again. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to build a bunch of facilities that are located throughout the country. And the goal of these facilities is basically a whole alphabet soup of different law enforcement agencies and local and state law enforcement gather together in the same building, and they share information. And there's 78 of these facilities currently in the U.S. There's occasionally, they're getting added slowly, I think more still. But this one in particular was interesting. It's the West Virginia Intelligence Fusion Center. And the reason why it's interesting, well, okay, it's actually, I actually just noticed a second ago. So it's actually inside of the sort of state capitol building, I believe. And it's sort of, so this is sort of like typically what a fusion center will look like, is it's just in a building that's used by other city functions or state functions. And the reason why this is interesting in particular is because this particular facility is the only one that's known to do real-time face recognition. So they have this software made by a company called Tiger Technology called MX Server, and there's a really funny video, if you want to go and look it up, about basically it shows this guy walking in, they catch him on the camera, and then they say, oh, does this, the system returned a ping because it matched somebody who was on our watch list. And so, and then they, go and arrest the guy and whatever. But basically, if, the sort of nightmare scenario of face recognition, this is it. Like, this is, you're on a list somewhere, you don't know you're on the list, but you walk into somewhere and a surveillance camera that's just hanging out catches your face and then automatically alerts somebody nearby, like, there's some shady motherfucker and you should do whatever to him. And also hat tip to Kevin Collier, who I think is here somewhere, who actually reported on this facility for Vocative I think about a month ago. And so going back to that, if you remember the DNA collection scheme, where basically cops can collect DNA swabs from people, this was an interesting thing that I noticed about the way that this is being handled, is that they're actually paying a private lab to do the DNA testing that's gotten in this one particular town in Bensalem Township, Pennsylvania. They're paying this private lab to basically do the DNA analysis for them, called this company called Bode Cellmark Forensics. And they're doing it with drug forfeiture money, making it essentially free. So in case you're not familiar, civil forfeiture is a program that a lot of law enforcement agencies, mostly state and federal law enforcement agencies do, which are incentivized into doing, which essentially says, if you're stopped, like you're traveling cross country and you've got a bunch of money on you, or you have some, property on you, and a cop stops you, they can just decide, hey, I think that you're using this money or this whatever to sell drugs, or you're making money, you made this money by selling drugs, and so we're just going to take it from you, and you can't get it back because we're not pressing charges against you, we're pressing charges against the money. So there's like actually cases out there that are like, Virginia State Highway Patrol versus $10,000 in cash. And there's no way, and there's supposedly an appeals process, but it's, it's a joke. You can't get your shit back once it's taken like this. So it basically allows cops to rob you. So this is just kind of funny because basically they're using, and what I should have mentioned is that as a sort of reward or incentive to getting this money in bulk, taking it from people, the federal government, until recently, they recently adjusted the policies so that they don't incentivize it as much on the federal level, but it's still incentivized on the state level. Basically says that if a law enforcement agency seizes money or property in this way, they'll actually allow the law enforcement agency that's responsible for seizing the money to keep part of it and then use it in like a slush fund. And I think like there was like one example of like, a police agency or a police department that used it to buy like a fucking margarita machine. So yeah, they can just take your shit and then get money from taking it and then using it for whatever. And in this case, they're using it to actually do the DNA analysis for this particular town in Pennsylvania. Anyway, that's where they're located. I like particularly that they're located near Mordor Drive, in case you want to throw the DNA into the fire. Anyway, also they're on Furnace Road. Yeah, there's a lot of fire in this. I just realized that it's Furnace Road. Anyway, so more processing. This is a company called Affectiva. It's it's a spin-off of a project that was at MIT. And basically what they do is they say, hey, companies or law enforcement agencies or anybody who has large amounts of video archives, send us your video or photos or whatever, and we will determine how people are emotionally responding at certain points of the video with our proprietary algorithm, which determines, emotional content of faces. And so this obviously gets kind of worrying. They've had 4.5 million faces scanned, 40 billion emotional data points that they've collected. I think, from what I understand, an emotional data point is essentially like the way that they measure emotion is by sort of tracking different points on the face and measuring sort of the distance between them. And so each data point is, one of those sort of like metrics that they use to gauge emotion. And they also got 14 million in Series D funding this year. So hooray, capitalism. As of 2015, this is probably the thing that you're most familiar with in terms of like, so sorry, I should transition here. We're going into sensor nodes, which is essentially things that are lying around that while they may not have enough resolution or may not be equipped specifically to enroll you, like they're not like a cop taking a photo of like a mugshot photo, they have the potential to capture your, whatever, and then send that back for comparison. So they're kind of like the, like I said, the sort of nervous system that detects when there's like, a disturbance in the force, and then can report back immediately to these processing centers and then do all this comparison and whatever. So yeah, just a couple of, again, I noticed this is very sort of NYC centric, but this is just an example. 6,000 NYPD controlled cameras in New York City. 2/3 of those are actually privately owned. So those are just, either companies or businesses or whoever that are just saying, hey, if there's a crime, just tap into our surveillance camera, no big deal. And then another 7,000 are specifically positioned at places near low-income public housing, which is fucked up in and of itself. And then there's 4,000 more in the subway systems. So, needless to say, a lot of cameras, not quite as much as somewhere like London, but, you can get the point as to, wherever this is deployed, it creates quite a large dragnet to capture these features and compare them to what's already stored on the database. And then this happened a couple of weeks ago. Basically, Governor Cuomo, who's the governor of New York, announced this new program for bridges, what he calls crossings, which basically, and he sort of offhandedly referred to installing cameras that are specifically geared towards facial recognition at crossing points. He was very vague as to what he meant by crossing points. We believe that it's bridges and tunnels, and like when you're paying the toll for the bridge, like the idea would be you have the Easy Pass and it scans your Easy Pass, and then in addition to that, it pauses you for a second, it takes your photo. So you now no longer can like transit in and out of a city without being enrolled or being at least detected by the surveillance system. And then there's things like, this is in 2013, there was the Boston Calling Music Festival in Boston, and the Boston Police Department basically teamed up with IBM to do this pilot program for face recognition, where they just scanned the faces of everybody at this music festival without their knowledge. And they claim that that this was being done to sort of like test a system which will eventually become sort of more prevalent. And this becomes particularly worrying, I think, because you get into the area where large events like the Super Bowl or whatever, and you might start seeing camera networks set up specifically to serve as these sensors for those. So now we're talking about authentication. Authentication is what gets you into your phone, basically. There's a lot of weird, crazy new ways of doing this. So there's new features that basically allow you to unlock your phone with your face. And here's a method that was actually described by a recent research paper, which shows that actually you take some reference photos from Facebook or whatever, and then you actually take your face and you have a 3D model wear your face, and then we put you in a virtual reality system and use a virtual reality headset to actually mimic the motions of the face. And the reason why they do this is because most face recognition systems can detect when there's just a still 2D photo in front of them that's not moving. So what they usually do is they look for things like, blinking or like moving your head slightly, or they usually like instruct you to like blink and then move your head like this. And then they do that in order to verify that it's alive, to test for liveness, to know that there's a real person. But this defeats that because you can now paste somebody's face onto a 3D model and use that to access somebody's phone. Then this is stuff that happened a couple of weeks ago, or actually a couple months ago now, where basically it's now possible, like I mentioned before, to have a fingerprint on file and then print that fingerprint onto a material, which is a conductive material, which can then be used to access your device. And the top example is basically doing it without the presence of the user. And the bottom one is, this is something that just happened recently, where basically there was this warrant where they said there was this facility in California where the police said, hey, judge, give us a warrant to go into this place and just demand that everyone unlock their phone with their fingerprint, which is kind of crazy, because that's completely unprecedented. There's never been a case where, they've just gone into somewhere and say, hey, everyone, you must unlock your phone. And again, because the Fifth Amendment doesn't protect you against, a part of your body, it only protects information that you have stored in your head. So if not being forced to reveal information that it's possible, but we're not entirely sure if that's the case yet, but it's at least possible that this might be legal. I hope it's not. Then you get to biometric authentication, like the voice authentication. This is like, have you ever seen the movie Sneakers? There's that famous, scene, my voice is my passport, verify me. Well, actually, they have ways of doing this to, Google, I think, has a system that gets you into your Android phone by just using your voice. And actually, just a couple of days ago, Adobe premiered the software that lets you just take a recording of somebody's voice and it reads out the words, and you can just rearrange the words and make them say things that they never said. So very easy to get by some of these things. It's not a really great idea to have only one of these features being the only thing that protects your phone. You should always use, I think, a passcode. Sometimes exclusively a passcode if you think that you're going to be in a potentially dangerous situation. So countermeasures. So some of you might already be familiar with Adam Harvey. He made this facial recognition makeup, which basically breaks up the patterns that it basically disrupts the patterns that face recognition algorithms look for to detect a face. So it prevents the face from being detected in the first place. And the problem that we have with this is that this is sort of a horse race. You can design something that prevents face recognition algorithms from working one day, but the next day, there's going to be somebody who finds out a way to, get around it. So this is an article that I wrote for Motherboard, actually, about these researchers which built a neural network that basically has a 57 to 72% success rate of de-anonymizing faces when they're pixelated. So you've probably seen redacted faces. They have either pixels over them or they're blurred out. And so this does a pretty good job, given a data set of 530 people, to actually, so basically the idea being that if there's a data set and you have maybe a handful of photos that don't have your face redacted or removed, this algorithm doesn't need to be told what to look for. It can just sort of work out, based on the information that it's given and not given, what it should be looking for, and then go on to identify that face and link it to another photo. And so here's something that another article that I wrote about this thing, which I'm actually wearing right now. It's basically a prosthetic, a fingerprint prosthetic, which enables you to, instead of enrolling your real fingerprint in your phone, you enroll this fake prosthetic fingerprint. And the idea being that if you're ever forced to unlock your phone with your real fingerprint, it just won't work because it's tied to this thing and not your real fingerprint. And so, yeah, this was made by an artist, an art student at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, named Mian Wei. And it's kind of a cool thing. Basically, he made this material out of conductive silicone and fibers, and the fibers basically form what would normally be the contours of a fingerprint. So it's not actually a fingerprint. It doesn't actually resemble a fingerprint. If you were to just touch something with this material and you lifted it with a forensics kit, you wouldn't see anything resembling a fingerprint. It's just a mess of different fibers. And so basically what you do is you enroll this to your phone instead of enrolling your real fingerprint. It's a design project, so it comes in this nice package. He actually hasn't mass-produced this yet. I keep encouraging him that he should. But basically, it's meant to emulate a Band-Aid or something that you buy at a drugstore. And it says for 3 weeks. And the point of it is to be disposable. So one of the situations that I sort of thought of where it would be useful is if you go to a protest and you're worried about getting arrested in a mass arrest during a protest, you wear the fingerprint thing, and then if you do wind up getting arrested and you're worried about the cops forcing you to unlock your phone, when nobody's looking, just throw it away, and then they ask you to unlock your phone with your fingerprint, and you're like, oops, it doesn't work. And I can actually, let me just demonstrate that it actually does work. So it's my phone, and then the fingerprint sensor is on the back, and and it's instantaneous. It doesn't, it's super fast. It works exactly like a regular fingerprint, and part of the reason why is because the resolution of fingerprint readers is actually still at about 500 dpi, which is what the standard for the FBI is. New fingerprint readers that are coming onto the market soon are going to be much higher resolution. I actually went to one of these companies and tested this with it to see if it would register, and it did not register. So in the future, it might be harder for cops to sort of fake your fingerprint by printing a fake one, but it also will be harder to sort of make your own fake fingerprint and use that to enroll in your phone. But yeah, that's basically the idea behind this. It's, these things are kind of all things that we're thinking about, that a lot of people are thinking about in terms of we know that these systems are here, we know that this data is being collected, and now, I hope that this sort of puts together sort of the different components of how these systems work, and maybe we can start to think more about how we can adapt, and either through sort of product type things like this, or at least sort of being aware of where these things are and how they exist, and so that we can sort of come about ways of sort of adapting. And that's about it. So thanks, and any questions?
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? Oh, okay, cool.
Hi, my name is May. First of all, thanks for that terrifying dystopian overview of reality today.
Sure.
So you talked just at the very end a little bit about countermeasures, and I'm wondering if there is anything that you're aware of or know about that people are maybe doing along the sort of having an enrollment, processing, and then sensor nodes for responses against ICE raids, or responses against where police are amassing. I'm thinking things like OpenALPR, where we have very reliable open source tools to maybe that just haven't been wired together to read, oh look, there's turns out these are 7 police cars that are all undercover that we know about because they have the same plates that are entering a neighborhood or something like that.
Yeah, no, so you're talking about sort of having a sort of a photo database of known police officers, and then a surveillance camera that detects from this one. Yeah, I actually don't know personally of any projects like that. Yeah, that's interesting. That's
We should talk about that then.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I know that a lot of the sort of sometimes a lot of the reaction to seeing all these scary surveillance systems involves doing sort of the inverse to the the surveillors. I kind of have mixed feelings about the sort of whether we should just be kind of reproducing the system verbatim to do the exact same thing. I think somebody was mentioning this before, but about some art, the way that some artists approach surveillance art, and a lot of times they sort of reproduce the systems that they're critiquing, and some people, I think Alison Birch calls it cop art too, because you're sort of emulating the same systems. I'm not dismissing that. I'm kind of neutral on the topic. I think that there's uses for both of those things, and I would be interested to see something like that, honestly.
Any other questions for Josh? Okay.
So anecdotally, I got my apartment robbed recently because I live in Brooklyn. And as part of the process, the cops were like, oh, can you do a DNA swab for us? And I did it because the cops didn't let me sleep in my bedroom the previous night. I was too tired to realize what was going on. It was a process thing. But I called the precinct later and was like, hey guys, I just want to make sure this DNA isn't going into a database anywhere. Which
it is.
They told me not, but we all trust cops, right? But my roommate was very shocked that I was anxious about this after the fact. And I think a lot of that's just he doesn't see any threat from these systems. And for a lot of us here, I think why these things are a problem, they're really intuitive. We understand why this is going to go bad eventually, but how would you explain to someone who maybe doesn't have that built-in sense of this is going to go bad eventually, that these things might be a threat?
Yeah, no, I think part of what I'm trying to describe here into breaking these things up into their different components, I think sort of aims to do that. because you give people, like the goal is to sort of give people sort of a visceral understanding of like what these things can be used for, and that, once, these things are being collected, and, at these sort of like different points, like these sensing points are everywhere. And so it's sort of like, I mean, it does leave a lot to the imagination, obviously, right now, but I think there are enough examples now where you see, especially when you look at the fact that overwhelmingly, disproportionately, communities of color and minority neighborhoods are targeted by police way, way more. And you see these kinds of things a lot of times, like we sort of learn about them, and then people in these communities are like, yeah, well, we've known about that for a while, because they're always the ones to suffer the most from it. So I think it really depends on what your position is in relation to these. In your relation to, like, have you had an encounter with law enforcement? If you haven't had an encounter with law enforcement, there's a good chance that you're going to think that this is not a big deal. But I mean, hopefully, sort of getting a more sort of like specific understanding of the various possibilities of how these systems work sort of provides a more sort of like it's not about what's being collected now, but the idea that, like, I think Edward Snowden says it's not about like having something to hide. It's about like saying that you don't care about privacy because you have nothing to hide is like saying that you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say. It's like it's like a privileged statement to say that, like, I have nothing to hide, whatever, so it doesn't affect me. But I think that understanding how some of these systems work sort of provides a more clear view into how they can potentially affect everyone, and if not you, then somebody who matters just as much as you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just have another thing to add to that around the, like, how do you explain this viscerally to people who don't quite get it? The thing that I tend to do is I talk to them about this system that you haven't mentioned because it's very much overseas right now, called the identity dominance system, which is built by the Marine Corps and sold to governments as part of foreign aid packages and things like Pakistan and India and Yemen and so on. And what it does is basically, in order to get any kind of government assistance or benefits in those countries, you have to actually enroll in these systems that are provided by us, our military, the United States military. So my question to people who like ask, why is this a problem? I'm like, well, I don't know. Like, do you want your direct deposit to be linked to your iris scan? Because that's actually what's going on in like these other countries, and it's only a matter of time before war front to home front, right? So like, they tend to be not okay with like autocratic systems, but like, politically, but we're actually providing the means to enable exactly that in all these places that these more whiter people who come to like, have money to go to events and so on don't seem to have problems with as much. But that's my sort of like go-to, and it seems to be relatively arresting to the people that I talk to about it in that way, because they haven't heard of these things, IDSMC and so on, and yeah.
Yeah, I actually hadn't heard of that system, and I think that in the same way that I haven't heard of that system, a lot of people who are U.S. citizens probably haven't heard of the system, that captures all of the, all the biometric information of everyone coming into the United States and shares it with every law enforcement agency that ever wants it for any reason. So yeah.
Yeah, I just remembered I had a question based on what you just said. The OBIM collecting everyone's biometric information at checkpoints. I had read about they're rolling out iris scanners at the Otay Mesa checkpoint in Southern California on the border with Mexico. And in the article I read, it said that they collect this information from everybody who crosses the checkpoint, but rest assured that for citizens, they don't hold the information. It's just for everybody else that they hold it.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, it seems like an obvious lie. I mean, what is there any like hope through FOIA or any means like that to like sort of undermine that claim? I mean, like, how do you? It just seems like I don't know. What is the another thing too, somewhat related, was the guy who attempted to bomb whatever in Chelsea like a month ago or 2 months ago. He was actually a U.S. citizen. I mean, he had been a naturalized citizen, but news reports said that he what tipped off, I guess, law enforcement when they were looking for him was a photo of him in an immigration database, which was kind of weird because I wondered how was it like biometric information that they had in an immigration database, because if he was a citizen, they shouldn't have had that on record. So I was wondering if that was, I mean, if that was like an indication of...
Yeah. To answer your last question first, yeah, it doesn't matter if you become a citizen. If you have immigration status and you come to the U.S., you like before you begin the immigration process, part of that process is giving all of your biometric information, and you don't get it expunged just because you become a U.S. citizen. So there's that. In terms of what you said initially, where about, you know, is there any help with FOIA? I think that, I guess, some of this has been done successfully by, you know, the EFF, the ACLU, and other groups who have been trying to sort of like, you know, FOIA specific documents that will reveal like how this data is used and who it's shared with. I think the thing you want to look for specifically if you're trying to FOIA around is data retention policies, and specifically like, do they have one? If not, how long do they keep it for? And also, do they give it to somebody else before they delete the data? Because sometimes they can just say, yeah, we deleted it, but they gave it to, you know, Customs and Border Patrol or somebody else, and now they have it. Because these systems are, you know, in a lot of cases so intertwined that there's almost no, you know, distinction between them because they just feed one another. So yeah, that would be what to look for if you're looking for like. In
So
terms
are there,
of
last question, are there different databases? I mean, there's like the OBIM, which is Department of Homeland Security, the FBI has NextGen, DOD, I assume, has like their own. I mean, so I guess you would have to like search for data retention policies for each agency that you were.
Yeah, it's and some of the, you know, the ones that I mentioned earlier are, you know, accessible. Like for example, the OBIM that is accessible by DOD and State Department. So, you know, it's if it exists in there, it's not like controlled by them. So they might even respond by saying like, oh, well, we don't know because, you know, we don't control that database. But they do access it, and as a result of accessing it, they might, you know, have, you know, retained data, you know, in sort of like the more literal sense. So yeah, that's probably what you would want to look at.
Thanks.
So talking about the law, you're talking about it's a horse race. It's always like they're always going to be ahead. It's pretty much like military industrial complex coming back home. I know that in Brazil, most of Europe, and in any country that survive authoritarian states, they have a law of habeas data, that is like habeas corpus, but relating to information about you, that is pretty much against any kind of secret lists on people. We don't have that in America. Is it something that people know? It's like data retention, all of it, that it starts right there. So would it be helpful to get this knowledge from Europeans because they're better off than Americans on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's always helpful to look at, and like I said, a lot of this presentation had to do specifically with the U.S. and, you know, U.S. Biometric systems that exist in the U.S. and used by U.S. agencies. But I think, yeah, you're right. There's a lot that we can learn from looking at what happens in other countries, specifically in situations like that where there's an authoritarian regime and then there's a backlash to the authoritarian regime, and as a result, they can no longer, you know, keep these lists. And obviously, that hasn't happened in the U.S. yet. It might. I hope not. But in 3 days' time or 2 days' time, whatever it is. But you know, without having that experience, you're right. Like we haven't had any kind of backlash that would prevent. You know, we have terrorist watch lists. We have all kinds of watch lists, and they're completely unregulated. So, and there's no way you can get off of them, or there's no way you can see whether you're on them. So, yeah, I think it's probably productive to look at the examples of other countries that have dealt with this and managed to sort of, you know, make it less sort of like authoritarian and less lists.
Okay, any other questions? Okay.
Hi, I was just wondering, is there any way of finding out how much potentially this biometric data could be worth for each individual person? We kind of are getting hints of like how much the investments are from different companies. And the reason I was saying this is, I suppose one part of the I'm breaking down why it's terrifying, and one is that, you know, at the moment to a lot of us, it kind of feels like shedding. It's just like, it feels like it's worthless. but it obviously is worth a lot more, but then we don't know what it is. And then it's gone through this automation that, when you broke down the 3 processes, and this automation itself has no way for individuals to sort of fight. And, only now are we starting to see these chatbots like fighting London, and London, New York, like parking tickets. God, that's, so it's like we're like way behind on any way of battling this sort of unknown system of automation. But like, first of all, do we have any numerical idea of like how much a set of data is worth?
I'm not really sure. So the way that these systems are sort of evaluated tends to be centered around how much data is in the database. So an example, which is not biometric data, but it's nevertheless a good example, is there's a company called Vigilant Systems that provides license plate reader data to the FBI and all kinds of federal law enforcement agencies, and basically it's a service. So kind of like that one slide I had about the Affectiva, the emotional intelligence service, they provide this service that provides them access to this database. So yeah, but I mean, in terms of, if you're asking in terms of like, how much is like one iris scan work versus, that's kind of interesting. And I mean, like, I kind of wish I could think of a way to figure out like, break down the numbers and figure out like what that would be. But I think that the way that they're evaluated mostly has to do with how much data is in the database, how good the software is that accesses the database, and how useful the data is in general that's being collected. And so because of that, that's why you have companies like Vigilant Systems doing the license plate reader collection. There's just private companies that are just scanning license plates left and right, and that's why they're able to charge so much, is because they have a system that's like easy to use for law enforcement agencies, and it's a lot of data. So yeah, but in terms of like actually like figuring out the cost per feature, I'm not really sure.
Okay, all right, one last question, then we gotta.
So another interesting thing about that is that if you check out a project that was in 2012 by someone named Federico Zanier on Kickstarter called A Bite of Me, he did exactly this analysis of trying to figure out how much is my like data browsing worth versus my fingerprint versus my this or that other thing as an art project that was funded and happened up on Kickstarter. So Google A Bite of Me on Kickstarter, and you'll find interesting just like visualization of that kind of thing. It doesn't answer the question, but it provides some way of like giving you this visceral feel of what, how is this in fact getting monetized and by how much. It's just a cool project sort of art-wise and also for that issue.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard of that. I mean, the more I hear about like sort of trying to assign a cost, the more I kind of think in the other direction though, which is that like, it's kind of dehumanizing to sort of like assign a value to this, because the thing about data that's personal data that we sort of seem to like live in it and swim in it constantly, but there seems to be this like hesitance to recognize that like data that's collected about us is us, like it's not just about us. And that's why companies like Facebook and Google that basically process personal data as a business model are basically farmers, like they're farming people. So I appreciate the example. I'm interested in seeing what that project is about. But I think ultimately what I would say is that we can't allow this data to be sort of like assigned a value to further dehumanize the fact that it is like us.
All right, thanks, Josh. Thank you.